Have you ever noticed how some headlines, some big geopolitical stories seem to just loop back around every few years?
Mhm.
It's like they're echoing this familiar drumbeat.
Yeah, like a broken record sometimes.
Exactly. They never quite seem to get resolved, but they just keep shaping global policy, sparking debate. It's like this recurring theme in the background.
It really is.
Well, today we're going to plunge into one of those exact kinds of narratives, one that's been resonating across the Middle East and honestly far beyond for what, over 3 decades now?
Indeed. We're setting out on a deep dive today into these remarkably consistent claims coming from Israel, the assertion that Iran is perpetually, like, right on the cusp of getting nuclear weapons.
Right, not just something that popped up
Oh,
recently.
no, not at all. This isn't just a recent news cycle thing. It's this deeply rooted story. Its origins go all the way back to the early 1990s.
Wow, okay.
And understanding how it started, how it's evolved over time,
Uh,
that's absolutely crucial, I think, to really getting a handle on what it means today.
okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. We're going to try and unpack this whole long-running saga.
Yep.
We'll pull out the most important bits from, historical analysis of these claims, trace where they started,
Hmm.
track how the warnings changed over different times,
Right.
and really look hard at how they stack up against what intelligence agencies were saying.
Yeah, that comparison is key.
And then finally, explore the bigger picture. What does it all mean for the Middle East, for the rest of us?
Exactly. The goal is that you, listening, will walk away with a much clearer, maybe more nuanced grasp of what's a very complex, very long-running geopolitical story.
And we should say, for this, we're drawing straight from detailed historical analyses, various intelligence reports. That's our factual guide here.
That's the plan. Stick to the sources.
All right, let's do it. Let's step back in time, really get to the beginning of this whole narrative. Early 1990s.
Hmm.
It's easy to think Israel's worries about Iran's nuclear plans just poof, appeared overnight.
Right, but that's not really how it happened.
No. The groundwork for these anxieties, and certainly for saying them out loud, traces right back to the specific time, a period of just massive geopolitical change.
That's such an essential starting point. Just think about the world stage right then. You have the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, huge.
Changed everything.
Totally. Didn't just shift the superpower balance. It fundamentally reshaped, well, the whole international order.
Yeah.
And at the same time, right there in the Middle East, the Gulf War had just finished.
Redefining alliances, power dynamics.
Yeah, perceived threats, all of it. These weren't just little details happening in the background. These were like seismic shifts, and they dramatically impacted how countries, especially Israel and Iran, started looking at each other.
Okay, so before this period, what was the relationship like between Israel and Iran? I've heard it called a cold peace before.
Yeah, that's a good term for it.
How did these big shifts, the Soviet collapse, Gulf War, turn that into what's been called open hostility? And why did Israel's nuclear worries about Iran really start to take shape right then?
That's a great question, because it really underscores the massive shift. Historically, back under the Shah, Iran and Israel actually had this kind of pragmatic, quiet relationship.
Mm,
They often saw each other as, useful counterweights to Arab nationalism. That was the cold peace.
yeah.
Maybe not official friends, but functional.
Okay.
But then, boom, 1979, the Iranian Revolution, everything changes. The new Islamic Republic takes this explicit anti-Zionist stance. Israel becomes, like, a primary ideological enemy.
Right.
Then the upheavals of the 90s just pour fuel on that fire. The end of the Cold War meant countries had to rethink their strategies. The Gulf War showed just how fragile regional security could be.
Because everyone's reevaluating threats.
Exactly. And Iran, under its new revolutionary leadership, was increasingly seen through this lens, a rising ideologically hostile power. So any hint of a nuclear program, even if it was basic back then, was viewed as potentially an existential threat.
And it was in that new, really polarized atmosphere that these Israeli concerns about an Iranian bomb started to, well, crystallize and become public.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And what's really striking is how fast these worries moved from maybe internal discussions to very public, very high-level statements.
Yeah, the evidence seems to really point to 1992 as the key year. That's when these claims first properly surfaced in public.
Hmm.
And the person right at the forefront making these warnings, none other than Benjamin Netanyahu. He was a big figure in the Israeli Knesset back then.
Oh, absolutely instrumental. He basically shaped this narrative right from the start.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote this column in Yedioth Ahronoth, a major Israeli paper,
Mm-hmm.
and in it, he explicitly warned about what he called controversially a Muslim bomb.
Wow.
And he didn't just leave it there. February 1993, he writes another piece, even more direct title, The Greatest Danger.
Okay.
And in it, he writes, and this is a direct quote, "The rulers of Iran have said repeatedly that they will have an Islamic bomb and that its first target is Israel."
So not subtle.
Not subtle at all. This wasn't just some vague worry. It was a very public, very direct accusation framing Iran's nuclear ambitions as an immediate, specific, existential threat to Israel.
And critically, it wasn't just, oh, they might want one someday. He put a date on it, a really specific early prediction.
He did.
He said Iran would develop its first nuclear bomb by 1999.
Yeah.
That detail feels huge. It really sets the stage for this recurring pattern we're going to be talking about, right?
Right.
It established right from the get-go this feeling of a precise ticking clock, an imminent deadline for a threat that, well, as we'll see, kept getting pushed back.
Precisely. That specific time frame, 1999, even though it didn't happen, it became a kind of hallmark of these warnings.
Gave them urgency.
Yeah, urgency and a specificity that maybe more general warnings wouldn't have. And then, as Netanyahu's career took off, he becomes prime minister for the first time in 96.
Mm-hmm.
These warnings didn't just keep going. They got louder, more intense, and suddenly they had a much bigger global audience.
You can see that clear ramp up in his 1995 book, Fighting Terrorism.
Right.
In it, he repeats that Iran was, quote, between 3 and 5 years away from possessing the prerequisites required for the independent production of nuclear weapons.
There it is again.
So right there, that pattern is getting locked in. Consistent, specific, often pretty short time frames for Iran getting the bomb, always making it sound like it's just around the corner.
And by 1996, he's taken this urgent message right to the top levels of global power. He gives this really significant, highly watched speech to the U.S. Congress.
Big stage.
Huge stage. And it was a dire warning, designed to hit hard internationally. He said flat out that if Iran got nukes, it could presage catastrophic consequences, not only for my country and not only for the Middle East, but for all mankind.
Wow.
And then he stressed, really emphasizing it, that the deadline for attaining this goal is getting extremely close. The message was crystal clear. Act now or face global disaster.
So even right back here at the very start of this narrative, you can already see how precise these early predictions were meant to sound.
The implied urgency.
Yeah, the powerful implied urgency baked into them. It was never just, we're worried. It was always about specific dates, specific short timelines, this very real feeling of impending doom, even if those dates kept moving further into the future.
Yeah, it really laid down a powerful blueprint, didn't it, for how these warnings would keep evolving over the next, couple of decades.
Absolutely. And that blueprint, like you said, it just set the stage for even more intense warnings in the decades that followed. So let's move into the 2000s, the 2010s. This is where the stakes really seem to get higher. Netanyahu's warnings, they start getting even more international attention, especially these repeated high-profile trips to speak before the U.S. Congress.
Yeah, it became almost a familiar fixture on Capitol Hill, didn't it? This insistent message coming across the Atlantic.
It did. And there's this really fascinating detail from his 2002 testimony to Congress. You mentioned the broader context he wove in.
Right. It's quite something. He was actually there arguing pretty strongly for military action against Iraq.
At the same time.
At the very same time, he was giving these dire warnings about Iran's nuclear plans. He specifically said, quote, "The two nations that are vying, competing with each other, who will be the first to achieve nuclear weapons, is Iraq and Iran."
Huh. So linking them directly.
Exactly. It wasn't just this isolated worry about Iran. It shows how the perceived Iranian nuclear threat was being very skillfully woven together with other big geopolitical concerns of that moment, like Saddam Hussein's Iraq, painting this picture of a wider, interconnected regional danger.
But probably the most visually memorable moment,
Yeah.
the one that I bet has stuck in a lot of people's minds, that came during his speech to the UN General Assembly in September 2012.
Yes.
The unforgettable cartoon bomb moment.
Oh, yeah. That was something else.
For anyone who doesn't quite remember it, can you just paint a picture for us? What happened and why was it so significant?
It was pure political theater, really, designed for maximum visual impact. Netanyahu's up there at the podium, and he holds up this big chart. It's basically a cartoon-like drawing of an old-fashioned round bomb, with a lit fuse sticking out.
Oh, I remember seeing images of that.
And then he takes out a red marker, and he literally draws a line, a red line across the bomb diagram. He puts it at the point labeled 90% uranium enrichment.
Okay.
And he argues, this is it. This is the absolute point Iran cannot be allowed to cross. Because that, he says, is the threshold to weaponization.
And his prediction that came with it.
Stark.
Mm.
Delivered with real dramatic urgency. He says, by next spring, at most by next summer, at current enrichment rates, they will have finished the medium enrichment and move on to the final stage.
Wow.
And then he adds, really hammering home the immediacy, that it would be only a few months, possibly a few weeks, before they get enough enriched uranium for the first bomb.
That's a really potent image. And just for our listeners who track the technical side, 90% enrichment, that is generally considered weapons grade, right?
That's correct. It's uranium purified to a very high level, enough for a nuclear device. It's very different from the much lower enrichment levels needed for, say, nuclear power plants or medical isotopes.
So this visual demonstration, drawing the red line, it wasn't just making a prediction. It was a very public, very urgent warning about that final critical step towards actually building a bomb. A step he was saying was just months, maybe even weeks away.
Exactly. The message couldn't have been clear. Iran is right on the verge of crossing the nuclear threshold. World needs to act now.
But then, just 1 month later, something pretty remarkable happens. Something comes to light that kind of recontextualizes that whole dramatic UN speech.
This is really a significant aha moment, I think, for understanding this whole pattern.
You're talking about the leaked documents, the ones that showed a pretty stunning contradiction.
That's the one. This is where that public political narrative starts to really diverge very sharply from what intelligence agencies were apparently assessing.
Okay, tell us about that.
So a classified cable from Mossad, that's Israel's main intelligence agency, gets leaked. It's dated October 22, 2012. So just weeks after Netanyahu's big UN speech with the bomb chart.
Okay.
And this internal Mossad assessment states, quite directly, that Iran was, quote, not performing the activity necessary to produce weapons.
Wow. From Mossad itself.
From Mossad itself. And it adds that Iran doesn't appear to be ready to enrich uranium to the higher levels needed for a nuclear bomb. I mean, that's a pretty stunning internal view from Israel's own top spies, standing in really stark contrast to the extremely public, extremely urgent warnings their own prime minister was making on the world stage.
And it wasn't just Mossad saying this internally, was it? Didn't this view actually line up with what the U.S. was saying at the time?
It did. That internal Israeli assessment pretty much aligned with the 2012 U.S. National Intelligence Estimate, the NIE, which also concluded back then that there was no hard evidence that Iran had actually made the decision to take its nuclear infrastructure and, build weapons with it.
So you've got this very dramatic public warning from a political leader, complete with a visual aid.
The cartoon bomb.
While behind the scenes, intelligence agencies, both in the U.S. and, crucially, within Israel itself, seem to be conveying something quite different. Less alarming, perhaps.
Definitely less alarming in terms of imminent threat.
Yeah.
That's a truly remarkable divergence, isn't it?
It really is. It raises some pretty profound questions.
It does. It makes you start to wonder, okay, what could be the potential upside for a political leader to create that kind of credibility gap? To say something publicly that seems at odds with what their own intelligence services are telling them.
Yeah.
And this becomes a kind of recurring theme in this whole story we're diving into. This disconnect between the political messaging, which is often designed to shape public opinion, shape policy, and the often more nuanced, sometimes even contradictory intelligence assessments happening behind closed doors. That 2012 moment is just a really stark example of that whole dynamic.
And incredibly, this pattern, this whole narrative, it isn't just ancient history we're digging up.
No, not at all.
It continues right up to the present day. We're not just looking back at old headlines from the 90s or 2012. This is an ongoing story shaping events right now. Netanyahu's rhetoric, for example, has intensified again very recently, especially around those 2025 Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear sites.
That's right. Following those attacks, those direct strikes, Netanyahu was very quick to come out publicly and claim, yet again, that Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time.
Familiar language.
Very familiar. And that it could be weeks away from achieving nuclear capability. So this brings the whole narrative right up to our current moment. It really shows how enduring, how consistent these claims are, almost regardless of what specific technological steps Iran has or hasn't taken, or how the wider geopolitics have shifted over, 30-plus years. The framing stays remarkably similar.
And almost predictably now, we continue to see this notable divergence from the intelligence community, even today. Current U.S. intelligence assessments still don't seem to fully back up these claims of Iran being, weeks away from a bomb.
That's correct. For instance, you had the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, testifying before the Senate Intelligence Committee in March 2025. And she stated that the intelligence community, quote, continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003.
That's a pretty clear statement and a significant difference from the weeks away warnings.
It is a very consistent point of difference. And just to add another layer to that, you have the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. They're the global nuclear watchdog, right? They monitor Iran's program closely.
Right.
Their May 2025 report came out, and it found, quote, no credible indications of ongoing, undeclared, structured nuclear program in Iran.
So again, aligning more with the U.S. assessment than the urgent political warnings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you've got this consistent message coming from both the U.S. intelligence community and the international nuclear watchdogs. And it stands in pretty stark contrast to these urgent, repeated warnings coming from Israeli political leaders.
So when you step back and look at these decades of warnings, decades, what really stands out is that despite how often they've been repeated, how urgent they've sounded, the consistent assessments from major international bodies and even sometimes from Israeli intelligence itself just haven't backed up these specific claims of imminent weaponization.
Right. The capability might be there, or growing,
Yeah.
but the imminent bomb claim is where the divergence lies.
Yeah. It's this remarkable consistency in the disagreement between the political rhetoric and the intelligence assessments stretching over such a long time, and that really makes you want to dig deeper into why this pattern keeps going.
Which leads us right into maybe the most analytical part of our deep dive today. Trying to understand what we've kind of called the art of repetition. Really analyzing the patterns here and maybe exploring the motivations behind these incredibly consistent warnings.
Okay, this is where we can lay out that timeline we've been building. The specific claims versus the actual outcomes side by side. I think seeing it all together gives a really powerful perspective on how this narrative has played out over more than 3 decades.
It is quite striking when you just lay it out chronologically. So, starting back in 1992, 1993, like we discussed, Netanyahu publicly claims Iran will have a bomb by 1999.
Outcome.
Actual outcome. No nuclear weapon by 1999. Iran did not have a bomb then. Simple as that. Next. Then, 1995.
Yeah.
His book comes out. He asserts Iran is 3 to 5 years away from nuclear capability.
Outcome.
No nuclear weapon by 2000. That timeline also didn't happen.
Okay, 1996, the big speech to the U.S. Congress, warning the deadline is getting extremely close.
Right. Outcome. Still no nuclear weapon materialized then or shortly after.
Fast forward to 2002. The congressional testimony again, claiming Iran is racing toward nuclear weapons, implying this urgent, active program.
Yep. Outcome. Again, subsequent intelligence assessments, including the US NIE's, found no evidence of an active weapons program aimed at building a bomb at that time. They believed it had been halted.
Okay, the pattern's becoming clear. How about 2009? You mentioned WikiLeaks cables.
That's right. Information revealed through WikiLeaks indicated he was claiming then that Iran was just 1 to 2 years away from capability.
Outcome.
Once again, that specific timeline just didn't materialize.
And then the really public one, 2012, the UN speech, the cartoon bomb. Iran is months to weeks away from enough enriched uranium for a bomb.
And the outcome there was particularly telling because just weeks later, we had that leaked Mossad cable directly contradicting the public urgency.
Right. Okay, bringing us right up to date. 2025, after the recent Israeli strikes, claims of Iran being a very short time, maybe weeks away from a weapon.
And the outcome, as we just discussed, current U.S. intelligence, backed by the IAEA, continues to disagree with that specific assessment of imminent weaponization. They maintain there's no evidence of an active, ongoing weapons program.
So the takeaway here, I mean, it seems unequivocally clear when you lay it out like that, is the remarkable consistency of these warnings over 30-plus years. Always pitched as just around the corner or months or weeks away, yet they have consistently not materialized as predicted, at least not on those timelines.
Exactly. This striking consistency in the, let's say, non-materialization of the threat as described by these specific urgent deadlines, it tells us a lot. It strongly suggests this is more than just reacting to the latest intelligence scrap. It points towards a deeply embedded strategic messaging approach.
Which brings us inevitably to the big, fascinating question, why? Why keep repeating these urgent short-term warnings if they keep not coming true? Critics argue, and analysts suggest, that these repeated warnings serve purposes that go beyond just immediate direct security concerns. And understanding this is absolutely crucial, isn't it, for grasping the full picture?
Oh, absolutely. And there are several potential dimensions to this that analysts often point to. One major one is domestic political advantage.
How so?
Well, the Iranian threat has consistently and very effectively boosted Netanyahu's security credentials within Israel itself, especially around election times.
Ah.
Think about the numerous Israeli election campaigns just over the past couple of decades. Netanyahu, who is undeniably a master political strategist, has consistently positioned himself as the indispensable leader, the only one really capable of confronting what he frames as this existential Iranian threat.
And that message lands well.
It resonates very deeply with the security-conscious Israeli public. It can often unify different parts of the electorate under that big banner of national security. By painting Iran as this imminent danger, he not only shores up his base, but can also potentially shift focus away from maybe trickier domestic issues or other controversial foreign policy points.
Yeah.
It's that classic rally around the flag effect, and it seems to have been deployed very effectively at critical political moments.
Okay, that makes sense. And then there's this other idea you hear, international attention diversion.
Right. Some analysts argue that by constantly hammering the Iranian nuclear threat as the #1 danger in the region, it helps to pull international focus away from other really contentious issues, specifically the ongoing unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Ah, interesting. So keep the spotlight on Iran.
Keep the global spotlight intensely focused on Iran's nuclear program, and maybe that shifts the international conversation away from, say, settlements or the occupation or the lack of a peace process. It redirects the pressure, potentially easing scrutiny on Israel regarding its policies towards the Palestinians.
And then critically, these warnings haven't just been talked. They've had a huge real-world impact on policy influence.
Absolutely crucial point. This hasn't just been rhetoric floating in the air. These warnings have been instrumental, really foundational, in shaping international policy against Iran for decades now.
Like sanctions.
Exactly. Driving multiple rounds of severe multilateral economic sanctions. Things that have had a truly devastating impact on Iran's economy, on ordinary Iranian people. Restrictions on everything from their oil exports to their access to global banking. And they've also been consistently used as justification, or part of the justification, for various military actions and covert operations.
Which brings us right back to that intelligence paradox we talked about earlier. It feels central to this whole thing.
It really does. Those fundamental questions raised by this persistent gap, this contradiction between the very public, very urgent warnings and the often more restrained, sometimes contradictory intelligence assessments, they're profound.
Yeah.
That 2012 Mossad cable saying Iran was not actively pursuing weapons, wasn't ready to enrich high coming just weeks after Netanyahu's huge UN presentation, it just perfectly highlights what the sources call this significant disconnect between intelligence assessments and political messaging.
And you're saying that disconnect isn't just an accident.
It seems unlikely to be purely accidental or incidental, given how often it occurs over decades.
Yeah.
It feels central to understanding the strategic calculation involved. It's not really about denying that Iran has a nuclear program or that its technical capabilities have advanced. Those are factual points.
Right.
It's about the specific, urgent timeline for weaponization that keeps being pushed by political figures, often it seems, without the full, explicit backing of their own intelligence agencies or those of key allies on that specific point of immediacy.
Which suggests a more complex strategy behind the public warnings, something beyond just reacting to the latest intel report.
Precisely. A strategy perhaps aimed at influencing policy, maintaining international pressure, or achieving those domestic political goals we discussed.
And this strategy, these decades of warnings, they've obviously had massive ripple effects, not just between Israel and Iran, but globally.
Huge ripple effects,
Yeah.
affecting global policy, regional stability. And it's really important, I think, to place this whole discussion within the wider context of the nuclear situation in the region.
You mean Israel's own nuclear capability?
Exactly. We have to acknowledge that Israel itself is widely understood to possess an undeclared nuclear arsenal. Estimates do vary, but credible sources put it somewhere between, say, 80 and 400 warheads, centered at their Dimona facility in the Negev desert.
And the key difference there compared to Iran.
The critical difference is that Israel has never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, whereas Iran is a signatory to the NPT, which means Iran has, at least in principle, agreed to international oversight and has allowed extensive IAEA inspections and monitoring of its declared nuclear facilities over the years. Israel, by contrast, remains completely outside of those international nuclear oversight mechanisms.
So, for anyone following global non-proliferation efforts, that asymmetry immediately jumps out.
It does. It raises big questions about regional stability, about the fairness of international pressure when one key player operates completely outside the established global framework. You have this dynamic where Iran, despite being in the NPT system, faces incredibly intense scrutiny and pressure,
Mhm.
while Israel's undeclared program isn't subject to any of that international inspection or oversight.
And that creates tension, to say the least.
Absolutely. This perceived double standard, this nuclear asymmetry, it seriously complicates any effort towards making the Middle East a nuclear weapon-free zone. And Iran often points to it as part of its own justification for developing its nuclear program, even if they maintain it's purely for peaceful purposes.
Okay. And getting back to the direct consequences of Israel's warning campaign,
Hmm.
they've been really tangible, haven't they? Far beyond just words.
Oh, incredibly tangible. Significant real-world policy consequences. We touched on the international sanctions already, multiple rounds, really severe, hitting Iran's economy, its people, hard for years.
Right. Comprehensive sanctions.
Very comprehensive. Restricting oil exports, banking access, trade, technology imports, causing real economic hardship and isolation.
And beyond sanctions.
Yeah.
Military actions.
These warnings have been repeatedly used, at least in part, to justify various military operations and covert actions. We've seen clear examples. Think back to the 2010 Stuxnet cyber attack.
Ah, the computer worm.
Exactly. A highly sophisticated piece of malware,
Right.
widely believed to be a joint U.S.-Israeli operation. It demonstrably damaged Iranian centrifuges, setting back their enrichment program for a while. And then, much more recently, you have the direct, kinetic 2025 strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. These aren't just theoretical possibilities being discussed. These are actual military or cyber actions with real impact on the ground, often framed by the preceding warnings.
And the diplomatic fallout.
Huge. These warnings and the policies they help drive have contributed massively to Iran's significant diplomatic isolation on the world stage.
Made it harder for them to engage.
Incredibly hard. Harder to navigate international relations, harder to negotiate deals, and it's profoundly complicated any attempts at nuclear negotiations over the years, often pushing things right to the brink.
And all of this inevitably just ramps up regional tensions.
Undeniably.
Mhm.
The warnings, the sanctions, the covert actions, the direct strikes, it all fuels the broader Israel-Iran confrontation, which plays out across multiple countries, right?
Yeah.
Proxy conflicts in Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, direct naval incidents, cyber warfare. It has deeply destabilized an already incredibly volatile region.
So when you step back and think about how these political claims, even when they seem to contradict intelligence assessments time and again, can drive decades of really severe policy consequences, impacting millions of lives, shaping regional stability. It's a really stark reminder, isn't it, about the immense power of narratives in geopolitics, how they can shape reality almost regardless of the underlying intelligence picture sometimes.
It truly is. So after tracing this back more than 3 decades,
Mm-hmm.
these consistent warnings about Iran being right on the verge of getting a nuclear bomb,
Yeah.
the historical record, when you really examine it closely, it presents this really complex, sometimes quite paradoxical picture.
Yeah.
On the one hand, yes, Iran has absolutely advanced its technical nuclear capabilities over this time. Its uranium enrichment levels have increased. Its know-how has grown. That's undeniable.
Yeah.
But the repeated, very specific predictions of imminent weaponization, the months away, weeks away, claims those have consistently not materialized as they were forecast on those specific timelines.
And the sheer consistency of the warnings themselves, spanning different U.S. presidents, different regional crises, different governments in Iran, it really does strongly suggest, as the analysis puts it, a kind of deeply embedded strategic calculus at work here. Something more deliberate than just reacting moment to moment to intelligence.
Yeah, it's a pattern that once you see it laid out over 30 years, it really stands out. It feels central to understanding this whole long-running story.
And the fact that Israel's own intelligence services, like Mossad in 2012, have sometimes directly contradicted the public urgency.
Right, that adds such a crucial layer of complexity. It really forces us to look beyond just the surface headlines, doesn't it? To consider the deeper motivations, the potential strategic objectives, the long-term political goals that might be driving these public pronouncements.
So as the Middle East keeps grappling with these nuclear proliferation worries, with the constant threat of regional conflict, maybe a final thought for you listening to consider.
Hmm.
What does this whole 3-decade pattern, the relentless warnings, the repeated divergence between political claims and intelligence assessments, what does it really teach us about how information or maybe perceived threats can be used, how skillfully they can be deployed to shape policy, to rally international support, to influence public opinion in what is obviously a very complex and very volatile geopolitical arena?
Yeah. And how does understanding this specific history maybe change how you critically evaluate future claims? Future warnings about national security, about regional stability, wherever they might come from. Something to think about.